Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 7 of International Political Economy. We are now firmly into the 2000s in our historical movement through the international political economy questions of the 20th and 21st century. So this week we're looking at a few different major historical events. Firstly, we're going to be discussing the period just after the crises of the 1990s, which we dealt with last week, and discuss how did neoliberalism respond and evolve in response to these various crises. Then we're going to track how the global economy was shaped by the war on terror after 2001, all the way up to the global financial crisis. So we've got a lot to cover this week. And we're going to start with the development of what would be known as the post-Washington consensus. So if I can progress my slides. These are the learning objectives for this week. And we have 3 required readings this week. And I'd really encourage you all to have a look, especially at the twos and also the McNally reference as well, but especially the twos reference. Adam Tooze has done a really excellent job of going through the almost day-by-day blows of the global financial crisis. We can't do that in this lecture to go through this incredibly pivotal event in huge amounts of detail. We can only present broad overviews. So I'd really, really encourage you to check out this resource because it's probably one of the best of the global financial crisis. And the global financial crisis is really the seminal event in terms of the global political economy in the 21st century so far. Well, maybe until we had COVID, but before then it was, a major, major political economy event. So please take a look at that resource. Now, as we noted last week, the Soviet breakup and the end of the Cold War was met by a lot of Western triumphalism. The narrative of US exceptionalism and victory pervaded policy circles, academic analysis, and media discourse, alongside the unquestionable dominance of neoliberalism globally as the endpoint of progress. There were 3 major implications from this resounding victory of neoliberalism that we are concerned with in terms of political economy. First, the political rationale for Western development support to the Third World, which was previously to stop the spread of communism, suddenly evaporated. And so there was now only one development model, that of neoliberalism. Second, and related to this, the obvious failures of the neoliberal development model up to this point, which we addressed in week 5 through the lost decade of development throughout the 1980s, led to new evolutions in the paradigm of neoliberalism to focus on an area called good governance, which would eventually transform into the post-Washington consensus. Third, there was a renaissance of the neoliberal piece, a development in the liberal piece, which was sparked by the United Nations Secretary General's 1992 Agenda for Peace, alongside the exploding internecine warfare that was occurring during the 1990s as peace building became a major industry. So we're going to start this week by focusing on the evolution of the so-called good governance agenda in global development thought at the start of the 1990s, and then address how this transformed into the post-Washington consensus and therefore evolving the neoliberal model from Washington consensus to the so-called post-Washington consensus. We'll then briefly review the continued emergence of peace building as an industry as we then look on to the war on terror. And like I mentioned, we'll conclude with the global financial crisis. Now, the paradigm of global governance became central to development and lending following the early 1990s, and this was led by the powerful financial institutions that we've spoken about before, the World Bank and the IMF. Now, recall that both for the fund, or the IMF, and the bank, or the World Bank, they had become by now centrally involved in global development. And as a result, they're rightly regarded as the forefront of evolving and applying the neoliberal model. At this time, both the bank and the IMF were faced with widespread failure and critique of its programs following the lost decade of structural adjustment, which we already noted before. And the World Bank 1989 report, which was titled Sub-Saharan Africa, From Crisis to Sustainable Growth, sought to find a solution to the critiques and the failures of the past 10 years or so. Now, this report, the Sub-Saharan Africa report, advocated the necessity for bank programs to improve what was called governance in African society. And this actually started to tepidly kind of reintroduce the state back into the neoliberal development model and the thinking around it. Still very much, rhetorically was focused on free markets, but there was some thinking about bringing the state back in as important to development so that the state could create and transform the institutions that would be required for a country to transform into a neoliberal market economy. As you may recall, we discussed in week 5 that the initial neoliberal model, which rhetorically and superficially appeared to be one that saw state engagement in the economy as anathema, discursively, it was all about free markets. And, this was the Washington Consensus. But keep in mind that we also address the tendencies for some important neoliberal theorists to see the real political goal of neoliberalism of separating and encasing the domains of the economy and the politic, or the dominion and imperium, respectively, from each other. Now, this important World Bank report, the Sub-Saharan report, effectively blamed African states for their lack of governance capabilities, which was a politically extingent move for the bank to divert culpability for its developmental failures, while also ignoring its own role in eviscerating these development states, so that the states couldn't exercise governance functions. And so the bank's concept of governance sought to construct a common sense understanding of how the so-called post-Westphalian state should act, such as, ensuring the liberalization of trade, the removal of finance barriers, the protection of markets through the police and security sector, and where it should not act, such as in wealth redistribution. This good governance agenda particularly focused on the creation of judicial and legal institutions to implement rules that foreign investors could quickly and plainly understand, so that developing countries were made legible to transnational capital. Now, the World Bank, importantly at this time, perceived that fragile and developing states lacked the necessary necessary institutional foundations that guaranteed neoliberal free markets, such as the rule of law, independent courts, stable internal and external security, and private property rights. However, a lot of these institutions, especially those of security and justice, fell within the traditional purview of judicial political areas of government, which were the remit of sovereign states and previously deemed too political for intervention by the World Bank and the IMF, as per their original Articles of Agreement written at Bretton Woods, as we discussed a few lectures ago. I think it was week 4. The governance agenda very helpfully helped the World Bank avoid this problem. And this was authorized by internal legal innovation at the bank, which clarified that the World Bank could involve itself in legal, security, and other jurisdictional institutions, which were previously too political, if they could connect it to some kind of direct and obvious economic effect. This legal innovation was vital in progressing the broader neoliberal paradigm to what we now call the post-Washington Consensus in bank thinking, which introduced the good governance agenda into the neoliberal orthodoxy. And so by the mid-1990s, the IFIs, the International Financial Institutions, or IFIs, good governance agenda proscribed apolitical, gold standard technical solutions to enhance the capacity of the state and institutions to create, develop, and protect markets. The post-Washington Consensus approach to development represented the institutionalization and deepening of this good governance agenda. And it was formalized at the World Bank through the 1997 World Development Report, The State in a Changing World. Now, I really want to emphasize how important developments at the World Bank are in terms of broader neoliberal thought, because the World Bank is really, and has positioned itself as kind of the knowledge expert on development worldwide. So what happens at the World Bank tends to reverberate elsewhere around the globe. Now, in this World Development Report, The State in a Changing World, the bank's formative experience in development during the 1970s and 1980s, alongside the havoc and de-development that occurred in the former Soviet states in the 1990s and during the 1997 Asian financial crisis, both of which we analysed last week, demonstrated to the World Bank and also the IMF by extension that for neoliberalism to take hold, plain market fundamentalism was by itself insufficient. At this time at the bank, there was a new bank president who happened to be Australian, James Wolfensohn, and then also the famous chief economist, Joseph Stiglitz. Both of their influence was really important in furthering the hegemony of good governance and this institutionalist approach to development, which saw the necessity of building institutions to secure a neoliberal market economy, which was formalized in this 1997 World Development Report. Stiglitz, the chief economist, who was also a highly influential economist in his own right, was especially important in transitioning the World Bank from Washington Consensus reforms towards post-Washington Consensus system-wide transformations, which were in a lot of ways much more broader and wide scale. These sought to construct the institutional basis for protecting the market dominion or economy in development. Now, the 1997 World Development Report admitted that the drastic rollback of the state in preceding decades sometimes tended to overshoot the mark, though the World Bank countenanced no blame for pressuring development companies to adopt such radical shifts in perspective, as the report noted. The 1997 World Development Report instead sought to reconstruct the role of the development state so that it could lock in neoliberal ideas and institutions throughout the Third World and the former Eastern Bloc. This formalization of good governance institutionalism via the post-Washington Consensus, or as it would be known, the post-Washington Consensus, has also been critically termed new constitutionalism, because it aimed to insulate economic forces from popular accountability, make alternative futures plainly illegal, and guarantee private property rights of private investors the world over. The three elements of locking in good policies, as set out in the 1997 World Development Report, were judicial independence, the separation of powers, and external agreements with multilateral organizations. And this hoped to restrain any impulse to depart from announced policy commitments, or as critical scholars have interpreted, lessen the possibility for democratic accountability. These measures locked in the legal limits on government authority and shielded business and private capital through what was known as supra-constitutionalist protections that were often afforded by international agreements and treaties, with judicial independence and the sanctity of the rule of law preventing future governments undoing any post-Washington Consensus reforms. Fiscal consolidation and macroeconomic stability assured by strict inflation targeting regimes of newly independent central banks, often supervised by the IMF, was also vital to ensure the predictability in the value of capital within this paradigm. Now, at the same time as the 1997 World Development Report was rolled out, we can see that the post-Washington Consensus, which sought to restrain states politically to protect the economy through constitutionalist measures, was applied in post-war Bosnia. Recall from last week, we mentioned the construction of the Office of the High Representative and the stewardship of the Bosnian Central Bank by the IMF. And this ensured that the policy options of the Bosnian government was entirely constrained. And even in its constitution, it was stipulated that Bosnia was going to be a market economy. So this constitutionalism basically restrained any possibility for future governments to actually change this orientation of the state to one which was open and based on a market economy and a very neoliberal market economy. And in this environment of constrained national politics and the insulation of external donors and reforms from popular accountability, Bosnia was a model for the international financial institutions' constitutionalist post-Washington Consensus development approach that was being formulated at this time, which we would then see rolled out to developing and fragile states across the early 2000s, and especially in the wake of the War on Terror. Now, despite the World Bank and IMF's innovations to the neoliberal development model, both these institutions had become increasingly irrelevant by the late 1990s. And I mentioned this briefly last week. The World Bank and the IMF faced the new millennium, shrouded in irrelevancy. Their general lending portfolios had nosedived following 2 decades of constant criticism. There was unimpressive development outcomes and a global commodity boom that had begun by the late 1990s and benefited Global South exporters. So Global South countries were less interested in getting money from the IMF and the World Bank. By 2004, the bank's incomes from loan fees and charges, which it gets from lending money to states, had halved since 2000, as the IMF's lending portfolio also shrunk to its lowest levels since the early 1970s. Now, 2 events in the 2000s, however, reinvigorated these institutions and saved them from oblivion. First, the US worldwide crusade of the War on Terror in 2001 left vast destruction in its wake, especially in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the IMF and World Bank were recruited in the campaign to finance post-conflict reconstruction. Second, the 2007 to 2008 global financial crisis reanimated the international financial institutions in their development role, resurrecting them to the center stage of the global political economy. And we'll begin by broadly considering the political economy of the War on Terror, primarily from a biopolitical post-structuralist lens that integrates the biopolitical insights of Foucault and the idea of the state of exception by Giorgio Agamben, and we'll also look at necropolitics by Mbembe. So we're going to start with a broad outline of the War on Terror, then turn to Foucault's biopolitics, introduce the Agamben contribution, before finishing with a synthesis of these perspectives from the African philosopher Mbembe. Now, in response to the attacks of 11 September 2001, the United States and other liberal regimes allied to it, including the United Kingdom and Australia, declared a new form of war, a war on terror. Immediately after the September 11 atrocities, President Bush announced that his purpose was to rid the world of evildoers. And at that moment, the war on terrorism was being called Operation Infinite Justice. Sometime later, Prime Minister Tony Blair in the UK told the Labour Party conference that he was part of that the present campaign should be part of a larger project of reordering our world. The form of this war was unprecedented in its breadth and intensity. Declaring war against an enemy which, as the President of the United States at the time, George W. Bush, described, lacks great armies and great industrial capabilities and has no nation or citizens to defend, and which exists hidden in caves and growing in laboratories, as he described, means that liberal regimes had committed to a war without end, temporarily, spatially, and politically. The massive high-tech assault with all the collateral damage proceeded as before, with the first target dislodging the Taliban government in Afghanistan that was accused of harboring al-Qaeda militants. Still, at this particular time, hopes were voiced that the strikes would be carefully targeted and proportionate, and that the campaign would be short, much like the first Gulf War was in the early 1990s. And in the meantime, the US told the United Nations that it reserved the right to keep its options open for possible strikes on targets other than Afghanistan. Then, as the Taliban regime in Afghanistan collapsed with the onslaught of the United States forces, the end of the war against terrorism was even further away than it seemed at the start of the campaign. Now, some of the reasoning behind this open-ended military project was revealed at the beginning of the war. President Bush had received 2 detailed proposals for warfare without limits from his Defense Secretary, Donald Rumsfeld, both of which at that time were temporarily put aside but remained on hold. The plans argued for open-ended war without constraint either of time or geography. The new warfare and security state renders our current situation after 9/11 as one of perpetual war, this war on terror. The period that followed the trauma of the 9/11 attacks is thus understood to be exceptional in history, leading us into campaigns that were quickly characterized as being no ordinary military exercise, especially in Iraq. The mythologically impermeable borders of US security had been breached, and America grew accustomed to a new identity, this of a nation under attack, with routines of color-coded threat levels and long lines at airport security. The state of emergency conferred special powers to the president and extended the responsibilities of far-flung branches of the military, including state militias and the National Guard and Reserves, changing the character of these institutions. Discourse on the conduct of this new emergent war brought shocks of its own, as reports of the treatment of enemy combatants filtered back from various fronts. Prisoners in this war were not prisoners of war, it was announced. Treaties on the limits of acceptable management of such prisoners were ascribed totally irrelevant. And at home, the ostensible beneficiaries of such policies, the citizens in the global West, were instructed that everything had changed. But had it? Critics of Bush's Iraq policy were quick to point out that not only was 9/11 and the resulting war on terrorism tenuous at best in providing a rationale for the subsequent invasion of Iraq, which we'll touch on quite shortly, but that members of the administration in the United States had been clamoring for close to a decade for such an invasion in such venues as the so-called Project for a New American Century. So it was not so much that 9/11 had changed everything then, but it created new conditions of possibility for state actors to execute preconceived programs as the boundaries of politically acceptable action on the part of the United States expanded. And on the home front in the United States and even Australia, polls showed greater acceptance than before 9/11 for racial profiling as a means of maintaining security, with such attitudes registering even among groups that had been subject to profiling in the past. At the same time, a kind of national security panopticon emerged, with calls for all to remain alert and to identify and report anyone suspicious. Now, to understand a bit more how the war on terror resulted in a modified notion of governance, we can look to Foucault first. Now, in Security, Territory and Population, the title of one of Foucault's famous works, Foucault outlines what he saw as the 18th century move from the sovereign power primarily directed over territory to power increasingly focused on the population. And if you're not sure who Foucault is or hasn't heard of him before, Foucault was a very famous post-World War II French philosopher who had very prominent lectures throughout the 1970s in Paris. And he was vital for progressing the post-structuralist school of thought. And a very, very interesting thinker, Michel Foucault. I'm just going to kind of give a bit of an overview of some of his thoughts as they apply to the war on terror here. So Foucault kind of traced this move, which began in the 19th century, from sovereign power, trying to secure its territory, to a move on focusing on populations. And from this point, Foucault argues that a new general economy of power began to emerge, which was dominated by mechanisms or technologies of security whose endgame was the identification, regulation, and circulation of populations. And this new society of security was enabled by making the old motors of the law and discipline function on a new target, which was often the own population of the sovereign. The new regulatory apparatuses of security reflected for Foucault a shift in the sovereign's concerns from the safety of his territory to the security of the population, from what limit to impose in the territory to facilitating the proper circulation of people, from traditional sovereign power to modern biopolitical power on the population itself. So in theorizing this confluence of security, territory, population in early 1978, Foucault introduced this concept of governmentality for the first time, and indeed acknowledged his preference for a history of a governmentality as a more appropriate title for his famous lecture course in that spring he was giving in 1978, which was instead titled Security, Territory, and Population. Governmentality was formulated as both a problematic that marked the entry of the modern state in a general technology of power, but also as an analytical tool that involves a methodological principle of going behind or outside the state a move away, in other words, from just focusing on institutions to conceive of a wider perspective on the technology of power, as he described. Governmentality for Foucault is understood first and foremost as an assemblage of not only institutions, but procedures, analysis, reflections, calculations, and tactics that form a totality of power that has the population at its target, political economy as its major form of knowledge, and apparatuses of security as its essential technical instrument. And the era of modernity is marked not by the state's takeover of society, but how the state became gradually administrative and governmentalized and controlled by apparatuses of security. And these points of governmentality, which focuses on the securitizing of populations through the security military apparatus, evidently came to the fore with the War on Terror, where populations were scrutinized for deviance or threats and then disciplined by restrictive and all-encompassing laws and legal innovations. Foucault's theories have indeed been very popularly used to understand the post-9/11 moment. And importantly as well, Giorgio Agamben was also a very famous Italian philosopher that has developed Foucault's ideas further and kind of moved in somewhat of his legacy. And Agamben is still theorizing today, and a lot of his most important work was actually written around 9/11. So these post-9/11 political developments kind of really were well described by Giorgio Agamben around about 2003. He was mainly writing in. Now, Agamben is quite interesting as a theorist. He drew on Carl Schmitt's work on the state of exception. This is the same Schmitt I mentioned when describing the influences of the neoliberal and the Geneva School of a neoliberalism, I think in week 5. And Schmitt was a Nazi jurist and had the idea of encasing and separating the dominion or the economy and imperium or the politics from each other. And Agamben also used not only Schmittian ideas about this separation of the politics and the economy, but also integrated the radical Jewish intellectual Walter Benjamin into this kind of theoretical totality, and especially Benjamin's theses on the philosophy of history and many other different sources from him. And in doing so, Agamben wanted to demonstrate in various ways the persistence of this idea of exception as a political category. For instance, one of Agamben's earlier works, he discussed the Roman legal category homo sacer, which rendered a person as a bare life, stripped of the protection of the law. And at the same time, and following Walter Benjamin's work, Agamben shows how a state of exception is really the rule. So the concentration camp, as he described, for example, that modern construction of located and horrible exceptionality is not an anomaly or an anachronism, but rather the materialization of the hidden matrix and nomos of the political space in which we live. So Agamben then used Schmitt's writings that argued that the liberal democratic state is not the ultimate universal provider of freedom and liberty, as its advocates would argue. Schmitt argued that liberal states were no different from totalitarian states if threatened. In such cases, liberal states will suddenly abandon their pre-established general norms that cover all possible situations in the face of a sudden, urgent, usually unforeseen events or situations that require immediate action, often without time for prior reflection and consideration. This state of emergency is denied by liberalism as a norm in an ordinary state of affairs. But in the face of emergency, the very basis of freedom, which underpins liberalism, is abandoned. Therefore, the norm that appeared to exist prior to the exception, or this state of exception demanded by these new emergency contexts, was actually not reality. Exception, argues Schmitt, and then Agamben after him, is the reality, for it is at this moment that we know truly the scope of the state's powers, according to law, and of our individual powerlessness. Agamben used the Schmittian ideas to argue that such states of emergency demonstrate the abandonment of the rule of law. And these notions of the camp and homoseka as places and persons outside ordinary law came together vividly after the 9/11 attacks, especially in the US state's description of its enemy in the war on terror and the construction of a camp at Guantanamo Bay to hold captives from the war in a space that was accepted kind of taken away from ordinary legal procedures. And subsequent revelations of the CIA practices of rendition and torture and secret prison ships around the world only reinforced the applicability of Agamben's work. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, Guantanamo Bay is located in Cuba, but Guantanamo Bay's territory falls under the sovereignty of the United States, even though up until a US Supreme Court decision in 2004, it was excised from the reach of US judicial law. Guantanamo Bay was first used as an exceptional holding ground when Haitian refugees were detained there during the early to mid-1990s. And as a point as well, the Guantanamo Bay complex is on the southern end of Cuba, but it is something that was imposed upon Cuba, and the Cuban government has forever been, protesting and highly unhappy with that state of affairs, obviously, because the United States has excised this territory from Cuba and kept it basically as a overseas jail cell. And, at this time when the United States held Haitian refugees in the 1990s, the detention of these refugees was an attempt to deter others thinking of making the dangerous trip into the US waters for refuge. But it was also an attempt to physically isolate these individuals from the bureaucratic and legal structures of the United States liberal democratic state. And even Guantanamo Bay is an attempt to make individuals physically, emotionally, and especially legally isolated from the liberal democratic trappings that would be available in the US, such as, rights of review. There's no human rights groups that can access the area. The media can only access the grounds with permission. And it's very difficult for legal counsel to gain access to Guantanamo Bay, and the conditions in these camps are incredibly bleak. And we can also see this in the Abu Ghraib scandal, which was a secret prison operated in Iraq by the United States military. The prison scandal here revealed low-ranking agents of the United States assuming their own capacity to act outside of the restrictions of law, instituting high levels of abuse on the persons held there. And if you see the images from Abu Ghraib, it's incredibly shocking. And this was played off as an exceptional abuse that was unauthorized, but this had occurred and continues to occur because the unaccountable deeming of persons as threats that characterize much of the operation of the United States and the broader Western liberal state in the war on terror is a sovereign act that brands such captives in Guantanamo Bay or Abu Ghraib or in other dungeons around the world as homoseka, as Agamben would theorize, an exception to human subjectivity, which exists outside the boundaries of protection offered by law, who may be killed without need for sacrifice, without any cost. And it was in this sense of homoseka that detainee and enemy combatant were linked with the master label for the enemy of the warfare or security state or terrorist. The arbitrary power to deem persons as fitting such labels grants this process a strategic ambiguity, such that the war on terror promised to be a permanent state of war against an enemy who shapeshift like a shadow and regenerated like a hydra. Yet the ascription of the sense of homoseka was not unprecedented. Indeed, the license to kill has many genealogies, including within the colonial context of US history. the genocidal conquest of North America advanced with the notion of expendability of native life there. And this was summed up at the time in early American colonial history by someone called Colonial Shivington. His grim directive on the eve of a Sand Creek massacre of Indigenous people in 1864. He said that his men were to kill Shahnee people of all ages, since nits make lice. And similar degrading of Indigenous people in Australia was also seen, of course, who were all regarded as flora and fauna and thus were subhuman and able to be exterminated. Now, building even further on Foucault and Agamben, African philosopher Mbembe articulates the concept of necropolitics from his book, similarly titled Necropolitics. Mbembe illustrates the large-scale discounting of life that is inherent to the state of exception by understanding that sovereignty, not according to the legal fictions of nation-state sovereignty or supranational institutions and networks, but instead in terms of the visceral and totalizing sovereign power and capacity to dictate who is able to live and who must die. Mbembe is really alert to a lot of formal, legal, and philosophical notions of sovereignty and sees politics working or politics as the work of death and sovereignty defined as the right to kill. And Mbembe even mentions that the celebratory tone and language deployed by the United States state when it triumphs in the extrajudicial killings of its war on terror enemies become platforms for the necropolitical legitimization of these murders, exalting American virtue, valor, and superiority through accounts of how exceptionally brave American armed forces risk themselves so as to protect the United States and the world from evil terrorists, where it is the United States who can unilaterally deem and apply such a label to anyone they will. These narratives of legitimation weave together this intricate sense of belligerent patriotism, American exceptionalism, and discourses of security to constitute an unbounded territorial sovereignty for America's right to kill across the entire world, alongside an unbounded jurisdictional sovereignty to formulate, enact, and enforce necropolitical law globally, as Mbembe makes a astounding argument for in his book. Now, let us look more in depth at a crucial stage of the early war on terror. On March the 20th, 2003, the Bush administration, along with Britain and America, invaded Iraq. The US-dominated coalition of the willing wasted little time in radically transforming Iraq's economy and political institutions into a neoliberal, free market-oriented state, with deliberate and systematic planning to ensure that Iraqis had no say in determining their own national interests, other than the model of self-determination upon which the United States had already decided. Now, the brutal nature of the occupation has not been an exercise in counterterrorism, as the US has consistently claimed, but a systematic and intentional means of mass repression to ensure a neoliberal agenda was fully implemented and unchallenged. And the result has been an utterly devastated country. Funnily enough, the US was very much stymied in much of what it wanted to accomplish in Iraq, which is more of a testament to the tremendous resistance, which is both peaceful and militant, of the Iraqi people at the time. Importantly for the United States occupation, after the United States invaded with its coalition partners, it quickly set up a body called the Coalition Provisional Authority, established in May 2003 by the United States, the UK, and Australia. And this was the official governing body of the military occupation. Until the so-called handover of sovereignty to an appointed Iraqi government on the 28th of June 2004, which we'll address in a moment. The Coalition Provisional Authority, or CPA, as I'll continue to refer it to, had full executive, legislative, and judicial authority over Iraq during this time, and acted as a governing body encased from political forces or their demands, and very much styled in the constitutionalist post-Washington consensus model, which we saw being applied in Bosnia. Now, with the UN Security Council Resolution 1438, the United Nations formally acknowledged the occupation of Iraq by the coalition and recognized the CPA as the occupation government. Iraq's crippling sanctions, which had affected the country for nearly 20 years, were then lifted by the UN Security Council. In their place, the Security Council established a development fund for Iraq to be controlled by the Coalition Provisional Authority and overseen by a board of representatives from the World Bank, the IMF, and the UN, which would control Iraqi oil revenues. And a free Iraq, according to the dictates of the US occupation, would be unfettered by government interference with market signals and would be a country in which individuals, human and corporate, would not be restricted by a semi-socialized economy as Iraq had been under Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath Party. The irony, of course, and what illustrates the real foundation of what neoliberalism is, as we've discussed so far, is that this could only occur with massive government interference and intervention, and in other words, military invasion and occupation. Now, while the evidence suggests from that particular time that there was no real political plan in Iraq, there certainly was an economic one. And Paul Bremer, who was the head of the CPA, wasted little time in laying the foundations for neoliberal US client state. Now, on 23rd of May, which was 5 days before the UN recognized the Coalition Provisional Authority's authority as the occupation government, the CPA Order Number 2, and this is how the Coalition Provisional Authority's orders were styled, this Number 2 order dissolved Iraq's entire army, air force, navy, Ministry of Defense, and intelligence services. Non-officers received a one-time severance payment and no pension. Officers received a monthly stipend, provided they weren't senior Ba'ath members. Iraq's army, Bremer, who was the head of CPA, decided would be reduced to just 40,000, would focus exclusively on border control, and would not have any tanks or artillery. Now, the majority of Ba'ath Party members were not supporters of Saddam Hussein or his policies, but belonged to the Ba'ath Party because membership was essential for advancement in any kind of profession. Now, in Bremer's first executive order, which was CPA Order 1, 120,000 government workers were fired throughout the Iraqi ministries, including 10 to 15,000 teachers. In a country of 28 million, where employment had already stood at 50% before that, Bremer ended up sacking a workforce of over 500,000 people. The CPA also passed a wage law that fixed public sector workers' salaries, which in Iraq's state-owned economy at the time was more or less the entire country, at US $35 a month. Whereas foreign workers at that time in Iraq were earning up to $1,000 a day. Now, in one of its first actions, the CPA also cancelled scheduled Iraqi local election. And further anti-democratic suppression occurred when, after the invasion, over 100 newspapers began operating, and most of them were critical of the CPA. The CPA then passed an order that prohibited the local media from so-called inciting attacks on other Iraqis and on coalition forces, which then any criticism of the CPA was said to do. Now, within a few months after the invasion of Iraq, the CPA announced that nearly all Iraqi industries were open for sale to foreign investors, the vast bulk of which were state-owned enterprises. The CPA thus attempted to move the entirety of Iraq's economy, with the exception of oil, from state-owned enterprise to an almost entirely privatized one to be owned, controlled, and for the benefit of foreigners. And it would be the CPA, not Iraqis, who would determine the selling price and then write subsequent budgets of how the revenue would be spent. Not only did this order authorize and fast-track the wholesale sell-off of Iraqi publicly owned industries, but it specified there could be no preferential treatment for Iraqis. And this order also included, very importantly, these investor state provisions, which basically meant that if any investor felt that the Iraqi government had impeded its so-called right to profit, it could then sue the Iraqi government in a third-party international dispute settlement court. Again, this judicial constitutional or super-constitutionalist measure is a key method in the post-Washington consensus. And previous protections that limited foreign ownership of Iraqi businesses to 49% had ensured majority Iraqi ownership. But now, after the CPA's orders, foreign corporations could buy up to 100% of Iraqi industries and then also keep 100% of the profits. Now, money from the sell-off of Iraq's state-owned institutions would go into this development fund, which the United States then used to pay for the occupation and to provide insurance and financial guarantees for American corporations to do business in Iraq. Now, the reconstruction of Iraq after the devastation brought on by the military violence of the United States invasion also benefited not only US corporations who were mainly involved in the reconstruction themselves, but also top politicians of the Bush regime. It was the Bush administration's Vice President Dick Cheney who had the closest ties and who received the most direct financial benefits from the war on Iraq. Cheney was regarded as really the most powerful and influential vice president in American history. He had an ongoing and extremely lucrative connection to Halliburton, which was a major oil services and infrastructure company. Cheney was CEO of Halliburton from 1995 to 2000. And Halliburton was awarded a 2-year no-bid contract worth up to $7 billion to fight oil fires in Iraq and to pump and distribute Iraqi oil. The contract was awarded actually in March 2003, which was before the war had even started, and before, at least in theory, the Bush administration had made the formal decision to invade. And this highly controversial contract was awarded under a Bush administration waiver that allowed government agencies to handpick companies. And the contract, not announced until 2 weeks after being awarded, was cost plus, which means that Halliburton was guaranteed a profit on top of recovering all costs. And it was highly suggested that Dick Cheney was involved in the appointment of this contract and then profited from it. And interestingly enough, Halliburton also stood accused of a series of scandals surrounding its Iraqi contracts, because it had a number of them. The Pentagon even found that Halliburton subsidiary overcharged the US military more than $61 million for fuel delivered in Iraq through to September 2003. Then in late January 2004, Halliburton admitted that it took $6 million in kickbacks in return for awarding a Kuwaiti-based company lucrative work supplying US troops in Iraq. And then another subsidiary of Halliburton was found in February 2004 to have overcharged the military another $24 million for meals served. And in a country in Iraq with an employment rate of, at the time, of over 60%, Halliburton imported cheap labor from South Asia to guarantee even higher profits. One of its other subcontractors organized 180,000 meals a day for 60,000 US troops and administrators. The company employed nearly 2,000 Pakistanis, Indians, Bangladeshis, and Nepalese in its kitchens and paid them an average salary of $3 a day, and granted leave once every 2 years. Now, Cheney, the vice president, had 189,000 shares in Halliburton and 500,000 unvested stock options when he was running for office as VP. He also received $200,000 a year in deferred income from the company, and his retirement package was worth $20 million from them. As defense secretary under the first President Bush in the early 1990s, Cheney had commissioned Halliburton to write a report on how all planning and support for military operations, such as preparing food, laundry, and cleaning toilets, could be done by one company, which was interestingly very prescient for Halliburton's eventual role in the reconstruction of Iraq a decade later. Now, even when handing over so-called sovereignty to Iraqis, as the CPA had to eventually seem like it was doing, the United States occupation entirely rigged the political economy of Iraq. The CPA handpicked an Iraqi governing council, which was then became the transitional government in mid-2004. Paul Bremer, in particular, was instrumental in ensuring that a former CIA agent, Iyad Alawi, would be selected as the interim prime minister, and demonstrating the application of post-Washington consensus constitutionalist measures that sought to restrain the state from challenging the neoliberal economy. The CPA economic orders were embedded in the post-sovereign process as the transition administration laws, and to overturn them required not only a 2/3 majority approval of any future legislative assembly, but also the individual approval of the Prime Minister, the President, and both Vice Presidents. And the CPA's neoliberal orders throughout that period were incorporated as law in the passage of the late 2005 Iraqi constitution. And then additional laws also ensured that coalition military and foreign contractors would be immune from prosecution by the new Iraqi government in any situation. So these laws were very much like a post-Washington Consensus style, what we call constitutionalist measures that basically lock in a country to neoliberal dictates. And interestingly enough, the United States also spent about $500 million towards identifying, creating, and then resourcing political parties who would be most supportive of its agenda and then guarantee a favorable outcome when democratic elections would eventually be allowed to be held. Now, kind of finishing up on the war in Iraq, the months leading up to and just after this kind of formal handover of power saw the most brutal of all American military actions in Iraq. In April 2004, the coalition attacked the resistance centers of Najaf, Fallujah, and Baghdad Sadr city. Fallujah was particularly brutal. It was planned and directed, the assault, by an Australian Major General, Jim Mullen, and the list of war crime allegations committed by the US and coalition forces on the civilian population at Fallujah is staggering. Citizens were instructed to evacuate the city, a population of 250,000 before the attack began, but men aged 15 to 45 were prohibited from leaving. But many family members chose to stay with their fathers and brothers. Then once the bombing began in October 2004, all exits out of the city were sealed off. And estimated minimum 30 to 50,000 civilians were then trapped in Fallujah when the coalition assault began. Cutting off water and electricity, occupying the hospitals and then denying medical care, shooting families trying to surrender under white flags, unleashing bunker-busting bombs, and then the confirmed horrific use of white phosphorus as a chemical weapon. Just a short summary of what the US unleashed on Fallujah, an absolutely sordid attack and a history that most mainstream political economy commentators entirely avoid. Now, far more could be said of the brutal occupations of both Iraq and Afghanistan, which we unfortunately don't have time to address here, but the political economy of the war on terror had profound and deadly impacts. And further, in terms of the international financial institutions, who are really important to our story, the World Bank and the IMF, the 9/11 attacks and the subsequent war on terror were groundbreaking. As we noted before, the World Bank and IMF faced this new millennium shrouded in irrelevancy. Their general portfolios had nosedived. They're under constant criticism, and no global South countries wanted to borrow from them. So let's have a look now at what happened with the World Bank and the IMF at this time. Now, the September 11, 2001 attacks on the US represented a turning point, also more broadly, in peace-building theory and practice. Prior to 9/11, there was a significant internal contestation in the international financial institutions as to whether they should expand their development activities into what was known as post-conflict situations. So once a country came out of conflict, a peace deal was signed, then the World Bank and the IMF would start lending them money. Very much what we saw in Bosnia, which is why the work in Bosnia after that conflict by the World Bank and the IMF were very controversial. They were also involved in a couple of other post-conflict situations, El Salvador being another one of them, as well as Bosnia. And both of them were actually had faced a lot of criticism at the time because, and I can't go into these studies in too much detail, but the economic conditions that the IMF and the World Bank applied to these countries coming out of war, El Salvador and Bosnia, and the austerity that were implemented were seen as hampering the prospects to peace in these countries by creating more inequalities and driving more popular anger. And the international financial institutions were critiqued on the basis that they were applying basically the same conditions to post-conflict situations as they were to so-called regular developing scenarios. Now, the 9/11 attacks left a palpable personal effect on World Bank staff and effectively muted critics of the Bretton Woods sisters' post-conflict activities internally and somewhat externally too. And indeed, 9/11 prompted the World Bank to question whether they had been correct in withdrawing from Afghanistan after 1979, with the subsequent Internal Commission producing a 2002 report on fragile states. Now, this report called on the international financial institutions to intervene in fragile states and build their institutional capacity through post-Washington consensus principles. The IFI's, or the international financial institutions' so-called fragility lens, or their way of looking at fragile states, reflected broader developments in peace-building theory, which emphasized the incapacity of weak states, rather than any particular issues with Western interveners who are trying to help them. Several important works in the early 2000s called for a much greater focus on governance institutions in these conflict-affected countries, which built very much on this like good governance agenda in the early 90s, which had morphed into this new constitutional post-Washington consensus thinking in the mid to late 90s. The general idea was that the pacifying liberal international organizations such as the World Bank and the IMF could construct the right institutions in fragile conflict-affected states that would provide technical solutions to so-called irrational conflicts and then allow peace to subsequently unfold. Such scholarship envisioned that conflict-affected states would acquiesce to international institutions and they would aspire to only an integrated sovereignty, as in compared to not a Westphalian sovereignty, and be straitjacketed into constitutionalist international frameworks that overrode domestic will. Fragile states by this measure and in accordance with theorists around this time had to demonstrate capacity for de jure sovereignty, or they had to actually demonstrate the ability to actually exercise sovereignty rather than having the de facto sovereignty enjoyed by Western states. That is just, you have that sovereignty just because you're a state. And through good governance, the idea in post-conflict was to insulate the economy from democratic accountability, with the European Union's control and rule over Bosnia being a poignant example of bridging this capacity gap of fragile states. Now, with this new focus on fragility and the international financial institutions increasingly getting involved in questions of war and peace, both the IMF and World Bank intervened in Afghanistan, even as violence continued. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go into the outcome of this here, but the post-Washington consensus reforms of the IMF and the World Bank in Afghanistan helped to delegitimize the government, protect private contractors, and catalyze inequality, which also arguably led to a rising support for radical militant groups against the government there. Now let's move to our next major event in the early 2000s. And this was also important in revitalizing the World Bank and the IMF, and it was the global financial crisis. Now, we're not going to go into a granular view of the global financial crisis, or as I refer to it, the GFC here, but I really encourage you, as I mentioned at the start of the lecture, to please look at the reading from TWOS this week. It goes into the GFC blow by blow in a really entertaining manner, and Adam Tooze is probably one of the most famous international political economists / historians today. And he also has a really excellent weekly newsletter as well, which I'd also recommend you signing up to. But if you look for Adam Tooze on Twitter, or even just search him on Google, you'll probably find his website with a constantly updated newsletter week by week, which goes into major political economy questions the world over. So will also be very useful if you're looking at political economy questions for and contemporary ones at that for assessment too. Now, in this part about the GFC, I simply just want to point out a few trends, tendencies, and implications of the GFC before we finish up. And I want to start with the food crisis that began prior to the GFC, but is commonly overlooked, and which laid the groundwork for really the inequality and pain that followed the GFC. Now, during 2007 and 2008, which peaked a few months before the collapse of Lehman Brothers, which had kind of demonstrated the start of the global financial crisis proper, the price of food, and in particular staple food grains of wheat, corn, and rice, had risen steeply enough to create a global food crisis. After some years of the number of hungry people hovering around about 850 million globally in the early 2000s, by the global financial crisis, the number of hungry people went past 1 billion, the 1 billion mark. And the food crisis was really raging as the global financial crisis took hold, but the food crisis appeared to be kind of displaced from the central concerns of the most powerful states by the GFC. But the food crisis is a really large and complex phenomenon. And there's many different aspects of it, and especially arguably supply factors, such as there was a diversion of grain production in the US and Europe from using it for food to its use as biofuel as a result of government subsidies that encouraged the development of the biofuel industry. There was also shifts in consumption patterns, which led to a diversion of grains and pulses into relatively expensive and inefficient meat production, and away from direct human consumption. The impact of climate change on food production also affected the yield of these wheats and grains. The increases in the price of oil also increased the cost of production and transport of this grain. The failure of the Doha round of the World Trade Organization to reform agricultural trade, and then also the stalling of agricultural development, especially in Africa, had all kind of come together to mean that the price of food was exceptionally high. But most critical authors generally point to the development of the biofuels industries and the subsidies to encourage that as generally being some of the most significant. Now, apart from these proximate causes, there are other causal factors that are more systemic in relation to the operation of agricultural food and markets at the global level. At the risk of oversimplifying these, and describing them in terms of the market effects of structural changes in agricultural production and speculation, we need to go back just a little bit in history, very briefly, to see how we got to the food crisis of the early 2000s. In the early 1960s, agriculture production had increasingly been subject to industrial style intensification and globalization. And this had led in developed countries to the increasing displacement of smallholder family farms by large agribusiness concerns who are able to achieve, economies of scale and deploy capital-intensive production technologies that were capable of market integration with upstream processing and to supply various corporations. And these processes also started to take place in developing countries, though initially slightly more slowly. And the developing countries at the particular time had a lot of pressure on them to adopt capital-intensive agricultural technologies and also to use debt to finance this development. And these processes at the time led to the impoverishment of smallholder farms who weren't able to really effectively generate industrial-style economies. And then the large agri-businesses that came from the so-called global north to developing countries then were able to snap up the land and farmholds of smaller holder farmers as they couldn't compete. And this was also linked to a phenomena of an incredibly high rate of farmer suicides in places like India. And a small number of agribusiness corporations increasingly dominated commodity production and transportation. These structural developments in agricultural production it kind of resulted in this globally integrated agricultural production change, which was driven by supermarkets and food processors. And these chains are capable of significant commodity production, but are also really vulnerable to failures and bottlenecks. And they also allocate resources according to a market logic, which is often entirely divorced from human needs. And in the context of wealth disparities, this market logic tends to intensify distributional inequalities across the world. And as a couple of examples, people even today in Peru suffer malnutrition because their fisheries produce is exported to feed North American pets, whose owners people in Peru can't compete on the capacity to pay. In Brazil, the Amazonian deforestation has been driven by the establishment of large-scale soybean production to supply feed to intensive chicken production facilities in Europe, even while malnutrition remains a significant problem within Brazil. And at the same time as this was happening, and especially in the late 90s and early 2000s, food commodities and finance had become increasingly intermeshed due to the potential significance of the rapidly growing markets in commodity-based derivative financial instruments and associated speculation. The US Commodity Futures Trading Commission had been loosening the rules governing agricultural futures trading since the early 2000s. And as I think I maybe mentioned in the previous lecture, what this future trading looks like at the level of agriculture is basically where you might have a farmer, for instance, who will contract with someone transporting their wheat, for example, and say, look, in 6 months, I'll sell you my a ton of wheat or my bales of wheat for let's just say $100. I'll sell you this ton of wheat for $100 in 6 months. And this was the point of this, is to give security to the farmer so that even if like wheat prices decrease, they'll still be able to get a good value for their wheat. And then the transport company would, agree to that perhaps, or maybe try to negotiate a different cost. And the idea was that over that time, the farmer might either lose out if the prices of wheat went up, because then they'd only still get $100, even though it was worth a lot more, or the farmer would be able to ensure that the price would stay steady if the global prices went down. Now, what happened around the early 2000s, the US Commodity Futures Trading Commission started loosening like who could be involved in these trades. Previously, it would only be people or companies who are actually like involved in agricultural trade, but this was loosened so that speculators could then be involved in these trades. So what happened with this like futures contract, this example that we gave, not only was this contract between like a farmer and a transporter, but then there would be effectively speculators taking bets on whether the price would go up or go down. So these are what derivatives are. So they're derived from the underlying like contractual or the contract or commodity, and speculators would more or less take bets on whether the wheat prices would go up or down on this particular contract, and then get paid out if they bet the right way. And they'd be, betting effectively with other speculators. And literally millions upon millions of these bets and these contracts would be created. So then the agricultural commodities index was gigantic by the mid 2000s, and the increased trade in agricultural commodities then tended to push up the prices of agriculture as well. So more and more financial players outside the agricultural sector got involved, looked for profit-making opportunities, and then vastly increased the cost of things like wheat and grain that had totally defied standard economic explanation. And this process of finalization would come to play a huge role in the global financial crisis. And we've already noted the rise of financialization in the 1970s in week 5 that has led to this. Now, just to briefly recap on this idea, the finalization that defines capitalism in its neoliberal form consists of structural transformations that corresponds to this a particular conjecture in neoliberalism. And we can see this, for instance, in the doubling of the share of US corporate profits that are going to the finance sector since the 1980s. And then by like the early 2000s, the proportion of profits going to finance had doubled again, and the share going to the broader so-called financial services sector, which was called the acronym is FIRE, which is finance, real estate, insurance, also doubled to nearly 50% of all US corporate profits by the early 2000s. So this demonstrated like the growth of financial markets and profitability, linked to financialization. And this was also very much tied to processes of neoliberal wage compression that also underwrote the recovery of the rate of profit between 1982 and 2007. Again, just after the attacks on labor, the historic victory of neoliberalism in the 1970s. The wage compression was a key component of the increase in the rate of surplus value in this neoliberal period. And it was accomplished by way of like a social and spatial reorganization of labor and production processes. One second, excuse me. Sorry, everyone, just a cat-related problem. But as I was saying, the important thing here is that financialization went hand in hand with wage compression as the neoliberal period really kicked off. And this was accomplished, not only by the direct attacks on organized labor in the Western industrialized countries, but also the removal of production facilities to the so-called global south as well, where labor was much cheaper, was less unionized, and was more able to be tightly controlled. And 5 other dynamics also really prominently feature here, which I've put on the slide. Firstly, this is what I was mentioning just before, the geographic relocation of production, and this expansive movement of manufacturing industries to dramatically lower wage areas, especially East Asia, and to a lesser degree of India, Mexico, and so on. Second, the downward pressure on wages, which was triggered by now a huge expansion in the reserve army of global labor, which resulted from the massive dispossession of peasants and agricultural laborers, especially in China and India, as we just mentioned before, because of these humongous agribusiness concerns, which basically, ate up farmer land and kicked the farmers and peasants off that land. 3, the increase in relative surplus value brought about by boosts to labor productivity, which is the output of work per worker per hour, which resulted from the combined effects of lean production techniques and new technologies. Increases in absolute surplus value triggered by an increase in work hours, particularly in the United States. Sharp cuts to real wages brought about by union busting, 2-tiered wage systems, and cuts to the social wage in the form of a reduction in non-wage social benefits such as healthcare, food and fuel subsidies, pensions, and social assistance programs. So these all were really important in not only leading to the inequality dynamics and the financialization of the early 2000s, which would then become important in the global financial crisis, but also help to explain the difficulty of the food and fuel crisis as food costs, soared. People's ability to pay for food across the world was even more impacted by this stage. Let me just progress some slides. So now, we're now going to go into more the meaty bits of the global financial crisis in the context of this much more difficult living situation. Large numbers of working class people in especially the Western industrialized countries turned to credit markets to be able to sustain their living standards. So this meant credit cards, this meant more mortgages, for example. And the provision of the greater amounts of credit to working class people in the form of especially mortgage and credit card debt in particular was underpinned by the provision of cheap money, or money with very low interest rates, which were designed to prevent the slump of the global economy that had happened with the Asian financial crisis. And there was also concurrently a demand from wealthy investors for what was called securitized debt instruments. And this is where basically there was debt packages that were securitized for purchase. So, for example, like a bank might, and I will talk about one of these items in just a moment, but a bank or another financial lender or innovator would, for instance, take the I guess like flow of money which came from giving out mortgages. So say, the bank signed up 10 working class people to new mortgages. They would be expecting, $200 a week or something from each of these mortgages. And they could what's called securitize or like bundle together these mortgage payments and sell them as like a financial instrument which could be purchased. And this is something that's called it's securitized. And the return from the payment of mortgages could then benefit wealthy investors, and that they offered really high rates of return as well. This process of securitization of debt, basically repackaged and being repackaged as a purchasable income generating security, enabled working class debt to comprise a significant source of new financial instruments for banks, pension funds, financial corporations, and other wealthy investors. And all of these trends led to a quadrupling of private and public debt in the United States from slightly more than $10 trillion in like the early 2000s to 43 trillion by just before the crisis in 2007. Now, alongside this huge debt and the access of credit by working people, we saw an extraordinary buildup of fictitious capital, which were like paper claims to future wealth within the system. And a key structural underpinning for this is the mutation in the form of world money that produced massive new industries devoted to currency trading and the related derivative instruments like futures, which we noted before, option swaps and the like. And they proliferated over the neoliberal era, especially in the early 2000s. And as much as there's sound kind of structural reasons for having these risk hedging derivatives in an era of high risk of floating exchange rates, derivatives provided a huge field for purely speculative activity, for basically financial gambling, as speculators made bets as to which currencies, commodities, or national interest rates would rise or fall and reap profits or losses according to the accuracy of their bets. And of course, the profits on the trading of such instruments have to come from somewhere. And that somewhere has been usually the non-financial corporate sector, whose share of total profits had been consistently and systematically falling across the neoliberal era, while financial shares has soared, as we've already noted. And this also helped create a massive polarization of incomes produced by this huge demand from the wealthy for interest-paying financial instruments, which was then met by the extension of massive amounts of credit, and particularly for mortgages and housing-backed loans and credit cards to working-class households, desperate to sustain their living standards. So again, these are totally interlinked processes. The rising ability for high net value individuals to profit is also equally based on working-class people struggling to make ends meet. And since 2000 particularly, and we're going to finish quite soon by noting this, because this is something that is spoken a lot more in not only the Twos and McNally reading, but also some of the recommended readings this week, is that since 2000, the mortgage-backed securities had been the flavor of the month then. And these were often in the form of the collateralized debt obligations, or the CDOs. And also some of the movies that I linked this week will go into how these collateralized debt obligations work, or CDOs. These are debts which are backed up by collateral. So collateral being like houses. And this is kind of what I was explaining before, and I'll try to explain it again and maybe a bit simply and slowly if I can, where you would have, for example, a bank, sign up, let's just say 10 working class families to new mortgages. And these mortgages, they'd pay again, like each of them would pay $200 a week, let's say. And the mortgages that they were paying and, the security of their payment would be that there was a mortgage there, or there was a house, or there was land that would be collateral. So, if a mortgage went south, then the bank could repurpose that house, as payment for the failure of the mortgage. And this was always based on high house prices at this particular time. And interestingly enough, and as I'll talk about in just a moment, the housing prices in the US, kind of a bit similar to us now, were totally overpriced. So it is called, a housing bubble. There's a housing asset bubble, which I'll briefly note in a moment. But the importance of these collateralized debt obligations, when the bank had 10 of these, mortgage payers, they would bundle them in the securitized instrument. So, this is all very abstract, but they would basically create a financial instrument which would demonstrate that, look, we have 10 families who are paying $200 a week for their mortgages. If you, financial investor, pay us for this collateralized debt obligation or CDO, this is worth a lot of money because it's continued. It's a continued revenue stream, and you can buy that revenue stream and enjoy that revenue stream, for example. Now, the issue with this is that because there's such a huge demand for credit from working class people, there was a lot of very poor people who wanted to have a mortgage so they could have somewhere to live. And within these 10 people who the bank got their mortgage from, they turned it into a collateralized debt obligation. And importantly, they said to investors, look, this is a high quality financial instrument. It's backed by land and houses. There's no way that these people can all pay their mortgages. We've assessed them as being really good. So it's AAA financial instrument. Now, the important thing here is that, like I mentioned, a lot of very poor people wanted mortgages. And so out of the 10 people, for instance, maybe half of them might actually be people who are really struggling to meet their mortgages. They're actually people who would be rated like C or D grade by the bank, but they bundled them in with other, like maybe higher earners in this like collateralized debt obligation, and the high earners here would make them a AAA financial instrument. Now, this was really important because as soon as the food and fuel crisis started to really heat up, and mortgages also increased as housing values continued to increase, a number of working class people then suddenly couldn't pay their mortgages. And so these collateralized debt obligations, which banks had been selling to investors, suddenly lost a huge amount of value because people just stopped paying their mortgages. Then housing prices started to collapse. And then financial investors were left with, and banks as well, were left with these securitized financial instruments, which suddenly lost all of their value. And then another part of the story, which is explored much more nicely in some of the videos and movies I've linked this week, is that additionally to this, the financial investors who bought these products had put insurance on them with major insurance firms who thought like, oh man, these instruments are fantastic. We'll give insurance for them because obviously nothing will go wrong. They're AAA instruments, which means they're incredibly highly valued. But then when they started tanking, and then investors started to say, well, look, the value of my instruments have dropped so much, I need insurance to repay me back. All these insurance firms were up for billions of dollars, to pay investors, which they had not been expecting and did not have the money to do so. So one of the first things in the United States is that the insurance agency started to collapse. Then the banks started to collapse. And this was then, building the flow of the GFC, which some of the resources explore in more detail here. And like I said, this drop in the collateral, the drop in the value of the houses, which are the collateral underpinning these collateralized debt obligations, the cessation of mortgage payments, meant that the entire economy fell off a cliff, not only in the US, but also in Ireland, the UK, Spain, and elsewhere around the world. And over the course of just 2008 alone, global stock markets then dropped 50%, which wiped out nearly $25 trillion in value in paper assets and plunged the world into the worst market outlook since the 1930s or the Great Depression. All five of Wall Street's huge investment banks went kaput. More than 250,000 jobs evaporated in the US financial services industry in just the first 2 years. And Europe also got hit massively hard with, like I mentioned, Ireland, Spain, Italy, Greece, Portugal, and Ukraine, with huge amounts of economic pain radiating around the globe. And maybe just a final point that I just want to briefly make, because I mentioned that at this time there was a housing asset bubble, which meant that these collateral debt obligations seemed like a really good bet. They were underwritten by really highly valued houses. These asset bubbles occur that often have two characteristics. Their economic value derives entirely uh, or largely from unknown future developments, and they don't have a normal like production cost, like land, for instance, or securities. Like perishable food does not undergo bubble pricing because everyone knows the future of like an apple it will like degrade. It won't be an apple anymore. And it has a normal production cost. There's a cost of growing an apple and getting it to the consumer. Machines might deprive their value partly from future use, but their production cost sets a limit on the price of them. Whereas land and securities, these fictitious financial instruments, they have no production cost to set a limit on the price that they can demand. And the economic benefit that will be derived in the future from owning them is really difficult to predict. And so they're potentially subject to a bubble process in a market economy in which such assets are bought and sold. And the best way to understand an asset bubble is by reference to the process that creates and sustains it. And an asset bubble occurs when the price of an asset, such as real estate, the corporate stocks, or the costs of financial instruments, rises due to growing demands for the asset, which stems from an expectation that there's going to be further gains from future price rises. And we see this in Australia with houses. Everyone thinks the prices will just continue going up, and this is based usually on recent past price increases. So people will look at the market in the last few years in Australian housing, be like, look, house prices have continued to go up, so it's going to continue. Like the music's going to keep going, as was the thought in early 2000s United States. And this asset bubble is a self-sustaining rise in asset price, where the past increases in the asset price generate capital gains for those holding the asset, which draws more investors, which in turn raises the asset price further, which in turn draws more demand, and it goes like in this upward spiral. Now, it's easy to identify an asset bubble once it's deflated, as we can in the GFC, where housing prices collapsed. And then it turned out that the houses were highly overvalued. People couldn't pay for them. The financial instruments based on them were totally worthless. And then the financial system totally collapsed. And every asset bubble must eventually deflate, since at some point there'll be no additional buyers to be found, and then the price will stop rising. Now, once the asset price stops rising, the incentive that had led investors to hold the asset disappears, and the owners start to sell, driving the process into reverse. And this is exactly what we saw with both the CDO type securities and also the house and land. Again, team, we're really only just scratching the surface of what the GFC was. And I really, really, really encourage you to read more about this seismic event in your readings. And we'll also deal with this more in depth in our tutorials. So I look forward to seeing you then. And thank you very much for tuning in this time, everyone.